Welcome to Understanding the Bible, the Story of a Book, with Greg Salyer. The Bible and its Interpretations, Hermeneutics. Okay, so we have two theoretically oriented lectures. The first one was on the Bible and its mediums, where we talked about orality, literacy, print and digital. And this one's even more so. So I want you to hang on, slow down, focus. We're going to get into some really interesting and gnarly stuff here, but I think it's absolutely essential for understanding the Bible. Here's another thing people do not do when they come to the Bible is they do not understand the nature of interpretation. They do not understand hermeneutics. And that's at the center of almost everything. Once you understand the Bible's origin in orality and how things change when it becomes written, change again when it becomes printed, and change again when it becomes digital, once you have that, the next thing you really need to know is the nature of interpreting a text. And here we go. It's going to be wild. Hang on. So to get to hermeneutics, we need to go to the source, and that is an ancient Greek god named Hermes, who was the god of culture. So here's some sources from the ancient world about Hermes. He was, for example, the god of writing, right? It's very interesting to me that that in ancient cultures we have gods of writing. Thoth in Egypt is one such god. I'm not sure about other cultures, but the Greeks had a god of writing, the Egyptians had a god of writing. Why would that be, right? Well, you'll see, I think, as we hear more about Hermes, why this would be the case. And it's because of, going back to the lecture on orality and literacy, it's because something new and profound had entered the world, whether it was Egypt or Greece or Sumer, and you needed a god that was associated with this incredible power. So Hermes is the god of writing, Olympian god of herds and flocks, travelers and hospitality, roads and trade, thievery and cunning, heralds and diplomacy, language and writing, as I mentioned, athletic contests and gymnasiums, astronomy and astrology. He was the herald and personal messenger of Zeus, king of the gods, and he was also the guide of the dead who led souls down into the underworld. Okay, already there's no god like this in Greece. No god who covers so many areas of human culture, and that's why I say he's the god of culture itself. Apollo's the god of music and retribution, and you know the story. There are gods for sometimes more than one human or cultural aspect, but Hermes is the god behind it all. So, not surprisingly, this god is a trickster. The newborn infant Hermes snuck out of his crib, stole the cattle of the god Apollo, and crafted the first lyre from a tortoise shell. Zeus, the god of all gods, was so amused by this young god's antics that he granted him a place as one of the 12 supreme gods of Olympus. What? Yes, because he was a trickster. And he tricks Apollo as an infant, right? So really interesting god. The god of trade. This is from Pseudo Apollodorus Bibliotheca from about the 2nd century of the Common Era. He writes this: outside the cave of his mother Maya, he, the infant god Hermes, found a tortoise feeding. He cleaned it out and stretched across the shell strings made from the cattle he had sacrificed. And when he had thus devised a lyre, he also invented a plectrum, something to play the lyre. And when Apollo heard the lyre, he exchanged the cattle for that. And as Hermes was tending the cattle, this time he fashioned a shepherd's pipe, which he proceeded to play. Covetous of this also, Apollo offered him the golden staff which he held when he herded cattle. But Hermes wanted both the staff and proficiency in the art of prophecy in return for the pipe. So he was taught how to prophesy by means of pebbles and gave Apollo the pipe. All right? He is a psychopomp. That is, he leads the dead into the underworld. This is from the Odyssey. Hermes, the radiant one, drew near to the gathering of ghosts of heroes, leading down the souls of the suitors who had fallen by Odysseus' hand. Amazed to see this, the two heroes, Achilles and Agamemnon, moved straight towards them and questioned the newly arrived shades. All right. There's so much to say about Hermes, but we also have so much to say about hermeneutics. So let's just finish up with Hermes here. He is the god of language. He is the god of exchange. These are all related. They may seem like a hodgepodge of qualities associated with this god, but given the nature of this god, he's going to be... I said he was the god of culture. I almost want to say he's the god of in-between. He's in between everything, right? And again, we're talking about hermeneutics, the science and art of interpretation. He's the god of death. He's the psychopomp. God of the crossroads, right? There it is. The in-between. The decision point. And at the same time, the god of integration. So these are his functions. He's the god of language, and he's a trickster. All right, so that immediately tells us that language is tricky, and hermeneutics, the art of interpreting language, is trickery, or at least it's a form of trickery. He's the god of death. Writing always equals death in the ancient world, and it still does in a way, in ways we talked about in the other lecture. God of the crossroads, where decision has to be made. So it's not like you can ignore Hermes. It's not like you can say, well, I'm not going to have anything to do with this god, because every time you're at a crossroads, every time you have a decision to make, he's there. He's there, and he's tricking you, which means you have to become wise. And he's also the god of integration, because all this does hang together. It's not like society and culture is a set of broken fragments, unrelated. It is related. It's just related in a very complex, almost hidden, esoteric way. And Hermes is there. He is there. All right. Could go on and on about Hermes, but now I want to tell you a story about hermeneutics. And we're going to move into some of the science of hermeneutics right now. So there is a literary critic named Stanley Fish, and he, for years, a major theorist, professor, he's a lawyer. So when I met him, he was professor of English and professor of law at Duke. Really interesting hermeneutic insights and theories that he's developed. But first, Let me just tell you this story that he tells, because I think it's a parable of hermeneutics. Stay with me. So one summer, he was teaching 2 classes somewhere. I think it was Johns Hopkins, maybe. And he's teaching 2 classes, and the first class was a linguistics class. And so it was the study of linguistics. And so he put an assignment on the board for the students to read next time. And it was Jacobson, Rosenbaum, Levin. These are all linguists. If you've ever studied linguistics, you will know these names. Hayes. And Ullmann, Richard Ullmann. And he puts, this was in chalk on the board, and he puts the question mark because he could not remember if Ullmann has 1 or 2 N's. It has 2. All right. Well, there you go. So that was the assignment, the reading assignment for the next class of the linguistics, next meeting of the linguistics class. Later, his 17th century religious poetry class comes in. And Fish is very excited, and he says, look, I've just got an advanced copy of a new scholarly work, and it's incredible. It seems they've discovered in a church in Scotland, they've discovered this previously unknown 17th century religious poem. And again, I have an advanced copy of the book, and this poem is in the book. This poem, the linguistics assignment. So Fish is interested in Milton and 17th century religious poetry and linguistics and law, but he's mostly interested in hermeneutics. So he lies to the 17th century religious poetry class and simply says, here's a new poem, a new old poem, a poem that was recently discovered, and you're one of the first to see it interpreted. Well, being earnest graduate students, they went to work interpreting this poem. The first student to speak pointed out the poem was probably a hieroglyph, though he wasn't sure whether it was in the shape of a cross or an altar. The question was then set aside as other students, following his lead, began to concentrate on individual words, interrupting each other with suggestions that came so quickly they seemed spontaneous. The first line of the poem received the most attention. Jacob's was a reference to Jacob's ladder, of course, traditionally allegorized as a figure for the Christian ascent into heaven. In this poem, however, or so the students told him, the means of ascent is not a ladder, but a tree, a rose tree, or a Rosenbaum. And this was obviously a reference to the Virgin Mary, who was often characterized as a rose without thorns, itself an emblem of the Immaculate Conception. It at once posed the question, how is it that a man can climb to heaven by means of a rose tree? And it directed the reader, this poem did, to the inevitable answer. By the fruit of that tree, the fruit of Mary's womb, Jesus. Once this interpretation was established, it received support from and conferred significance upon the word thorn, which could only be a reference to the crown of thorns, a symbol of the trial suffered by Jesus and of the price he paid to save us all. It was only a short step, really no step at all, from this insight to the recognition of leaven as a double reference. First, to the tribe of Levi, of whose priestly function Christ was the fulfillment. And second, to the unleavened bread carried by the children of Israel on their exodus from Egypt, the place of sin, and in response to the call of Moses, perhaps the most familiar of the Old Testament types of Christ. The final word of the poem was given at least 3 complementary readings. It could be omen, especially since so much of the poem is concerned with foreshadowing and prophecy. It could be O, man, since it's man's story as it interacts with the divine plan that is the poem's subject. And it could, of course, be simply Amen, the proper conclusion to a poem celebrating the love and mercy shown by a God who gave his only begotten Son that we may live. Now, Stanley Fish is famous for these types of exercises, and this is my favorite one. So, it's not a poem, but he told them it was, and it became a poem. So I guess the best way to sum this up in terms of hermeneutics is that believing is seeing. It's not as if we read a text and determine its meaning. We determine its meaning and then look for confirmation of that in the text itself. You see any relation to the Bible here? Yeah, there's a little bit. So we're going to get into this more, but there's the basic issue, is believing is seeing, not the reverse. The reverse is science, but we could argue even about that, but we won't today. All right. So what Fish created eventually was something called Antifoundationalism, and he did this in his book, Is There a Text in This Class? And that's the title of the book is an essay in the book, Is There a Text in This Class? Where some poor student walks into Fish's class on the first day and said, is there a text in this class? And he goes off. Well, is there? What is a text? And, you can see where it goes from there. So Fish he comes to his position of anti-foundationalism, meaning there's no foundation in the text, right? The foundation is elsewhere. The foundation of interpretation is elsewhere. It's not in the text. By doing initially reader response criticism, and that's where he came across Richard Oman, for example, who's a great critic who promoted, partially created and promoted reader response criticism. Now, reader response criticism is fascinating. It's basically what's happening in the reader as she reads each word. Well, so it's very much related to psychological or psychoanalytic criticism, more psychological criticism, because you're trying to get inside the reader's mind as she reads. But for Fish, this quickly became not about the individual reader, because the individual reader, he realized, was not acting in isolation. On the contrary, the individual reader was being informed by other ideas, not her own. What ideas? Well, ideas that existed in the culture already about the text that she was reading. Again, see the relation to the Bible? So Fish determines, okay, so there are all kinds of ideas in the culture about a text, and there are all kinds of cultures, by the way. But even within a culture, there's a multivalent notion of what a text is. Not just what it means, but what it is. For example, is the Bible a book of history? Is it a book of theology? Whatever. By the way, Fish doesn't really care about the Bible. He cares about Milton, who cares about the Bible. So this was my master's thesis, is to take Stanley Fish's work and apply it to the Bible. But Fish says, okay, it's not the entirety of culture that's influencing the reader. It's the reader's interpretive community. All right, so it's not culture, it's community. It's a smaller entity, right? So you come to the text from within an interpretive community who has told you what to believe and what to see. There you go. And you can go right back to my first lecture about growing up across from the street from the church, where I was told what the Bible meant, what I was expected to see there. And guess what? I saw it, right? So if that's the case, that leads to anti-foundationalism. It leads to that, by which Fish means, again, that there is no foundation for your interpretation in the text. It's not like this text is static. It's not like there's a text in this class. It's that you create the text, or more precisely, your interpretive community tells you what the text is, and then you see it. You believe it, and then you see it, just like the linguistics assignment that became a religious poem. Now, philosophically, Fish got into some really interesting areas, because anti-foundationalism ultimately means there's no foundation to anything, at least not as we have typically understood it. It actually goes to a social notion of interpretation, where these interpretive communities, where do they get their ideas? And it's from other previous interpretive communities, etc. And an individual can move among interpretive communities, but only with great difficulty, because the interpretive community is your lens to the world. So it's very difficult to shift lenses, worldviews, basic understandings of what things are. But that's where he ends up with anti-foundationalism. Really interesting cat, Stanley Fish. So let's talk about another concept related to anti-foundationalism, and that's the Hermeneutic Circle. And you've already seen it at work in the parable of the linguistics assignment, which is why I gave it to you. We can play off that the whole time here. So this is, there are two types. There are two types of hermeneutical circle. There's the intuition versus analysis circle, and the part and whole circle. So I think you can probably tell what this means just from the names, but let me talk about it a second here. Intuition is what I think the text is and what it's going to tell me. It's related to Fish's interpretive communities, but on a much more granular level, right? So it's like if you crack open Shakespeare, even before you crack open Shakespeare, you have a whole set of what Gadamer calls intuition, what Fish calls interpretive community values, interpretive values, before you even open the book. Now, you can then read the book, and that can be corrected, right? So you might read William Blake's Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright as an allegory of the digestive system, which it is not. But you can do that. That's pure intuitional reading. There may be reasons you want to do that. Do you remember that poem, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright in the Forest of the Night? What immortal hand or eye has framed thy fearful symmetry? So you can do that as an allegory of the digestive system. And I mentioned that, and it sounds crazy, but this is, of course, on the Bible. And much more bizarre interpretations, intuitive interpretations, have been offered for the Bible than the digestive system. You may know of them. And analysis is where you bracket those, well, you try to bracket those intuitional assumptions and let them be adjusted through the process of other strategies of other interpretive strategies. Okay. The other is part versus whole, and this is uniquely biblical, as we'll see here, where if one part of a text, a biblios, is, let's say, a gospel, is true, then the whole rest of it has to be true as well, and it all fits together. Let Wallace Martin, in this wonderful essay called The Hermeneutic Circle in the Art of Interpretation, he says this, or he writes this: the assumption that any humanistic text whatsoever, Shakespeare, Milton, Toni Morrison, is entirely integrated and derived from biblical studies and has persisted despite evidence to the contrary in all humanistic disciplines, biblical interpretation included. So here's something really interesting about the Bible as artifact, as cultural artifact. Its interpretation, the interpretive communities that attach themselves to the Bible, especially in the early forms of the Bible, have determined literary interpretation for the Western canon, because it all must hang together. I mean, have you ever heard a literature professor say, well, this really doesn't fit, or this line in this poem is wrong? No, because the assumption going in is part and whole are integrated. Just like if the gospel is true, then the book of Leviticus is true. This, of course, makes no sense. And you need a correcting mechanism, but actually you really don't, because many people live apparently happy lives doing intuitional or part whole hermeneutics, right? But I find this fascinating, and it's a really important point for our course, is that the interpretation of the Bible, the hermeneutics of the Bible, biblical hermeneutics, set the tone for the interpretation of everything in Western culture, even going backwards to Homer and some of the ancient writers before Christ. And of course, still applies now when you read a contemporary novel or poem or even a film. It all hangs together. Well, it doesn't have to. I mean, in fact, a very close analytical reading would show just how that's not true. In fact, we're going to get to that in just a minute. So the person here is Hans Georg Gadamer. He's the one who's associated with the Hermeneutic Circle and wrote a book on hermeneutics that was really powerful. And this is what he says, or writes. We learn that we must first construe a sentence before we see the individual parts in their grammatical significance. This act of construing is, however, itself already directed by an expectation of meaning, right? Fish would say interpretive community, which arises from the coherence of the preceding. To be sure, this expectation must allow itself to be corrected, right? If the text demands it. That means then that the expectation is recast and the text is brought together to unity of meaning through another expectation of meaning. Okay? Thus the movement of understanding passes from whole to part and back to whole. Hans Georg Gadamer. All right. I hope you're hanging in there, because it's about to get even weirder. Structuralism and semiotics. I've taught whole courses on just this slide, so let me see if I can summarize it for you. So we have to go to a Swiss linguist named Ferdinand de Saussure. And I love this story because he's just a linguistics professor. He's just teaching linguistics to his students. And he doesn't write it down. He just gives his lectures. But his students were so amazed at what he was teaching that they wrote it down. So the course in general linguistics is quite literally Saussure's course notes taken by his students. Now, what's so significant about Saussure is that he broke the other tradition of hermeneutics in the Western canon that was founded by Plato, namely that the word is connected to the thing. Plato has a dialogue called the Cratylus that most people don't read or know about, but in it, he in fact argues that this is a failed argument from the beginning, that the word, but he has to make it because of his other philosophy, that the word, that any word has a connection to its thing. It's a pale imitation, blah, 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 but it is connected. This makes no sense at all because the whole world didn't speak Greek, Plato, but he's trying to make this argument because he believes that everything is like that. He believes that a chair is a pale imitation of a pure form called chairness, right? Enough of that. But amazingly, that was the prevailing sense of hermeneutics in the Western world, is that, there's a connection between the word and its referent, the word and the thing that it refers to, its referent. There's absolutely no reason that this is true. In fact, it's demonstrably untrue. But it took Saussure to make that point in the 1950s. And what he says is, words are signs. They're signs. So anything can be a sign. It's the reason he doesn't call them words. Anything can be a sign. But let's stay with the word example. So a sign is made up of a signifier and a signified. So the signifier, quite simply, is the material form of the word. So it might be the sound cat that I just made. So that sound is material. It can be recorded. Or it may be the letters C-A-T on a page. That's the signifier, okay? The signified is the mental image it produces, the mental image that the signifier produces. So I might hear the word cat, or I might see the word cat, and what it does is produce a mental image called the signified of an annoying four-legged creature. Together, these two things make the sign. All right, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is, look at that formula. There's no cat. There's no referent. All we're dealing with, so Saussure cuts off the sign from its referent and says meaning is made not by the connection to the referent, to the annoying four-legged furry creature. No, meaning is determined by difference between the signs. We understand what a cat is because it's different from bat and mat and hat, because the signs are different. Now, stay with me here because this is highly theoretical stuff. Saussure believes in cats. All right? He believes they exist, and unfortunately they do. But his point is that there is nothing necessary about the letters C-A-T or C-H-A-T in French or whatever, in whatever language that is connected to that annoying creature. There's no necessary connection. It says, in fact, his phrase is, the sign is arbitrary and unmotivated. Okay? You can have anything, any sign, refer to that annoying four-legged creature. And in fact, this is where Plato goes wrong. That's the history of linguistics, is a bunch of signs, different signs, referring to the, quote, same referent. The sign is arbitrary and unmotivated. Could be any sign could refer to that creature, and there's no necessary connection between the sign and the referent. All right, good. Enter Roland Barthes, a semiotician. So the Greek word for sign is semiotis or semeion. And so the field of semiotics that Barthes helped to found was called semiotics. And he has this amazing little book called Mythologies. It was just wonderful, 1950 something. And he does semiotic analysis of contemporary elements of contemporary culture. Like he has a little essay on wrestling and what the signs of wrestling mean. He has a little essay on wine and milk and the differences, semiotic differences between wine and milk. And think about it, they're pretty significant semiotic differences, right? Wine is for certain contexts, milk is for others, blah, blah, blah. But the most important thing he did, I think, was an essay at the end of his little book, Mythologies, called Myth Today. And here's what he says. Now follow with me, following up on Saussure. He says, yes, the signifier plus the signified equals a sign. But that sign can also become a new signifier and be related to a new signified, creating a new sign. All right, so what he uses as an example, and this may be difficult for Americans to see, but he includes a photograph of a black French soldier saluting the French flag, the tricolor. Well, obviously that's loaded with signs. That image is loaded with signs. And Barthes was really interested in photographs too, by the way, and their meaning. So you've got a black person, which has historically and still has semiotic significance. You got the military uniform, which is a sign, a deliberate and obvious sign with other signs on it, like insignia, right? Medals, stripes, etc. And you've got the French flag, and then you've got the soldiers saluting it, loaded. So he says, there's more going on here than the individual signs of the flag and the uniform and the ethnicity of the soldier and his gesture. All those together form a new sign, which has its own signified, which is some sort of patriotism. All right, I could go on and on about this. It's really interesting, but I'm just trying to get you to have some familiarity with the history of hermeneutics here. So if you don't get it, it's fine, and we can talk about it more. But this is a pretty significant insight from Barthes, is that signs build upon signs. And again, the sign is separate from the referent. This is called structuralism as well. And a guy named Claude Lévi-Strauss did this in anthropology as well. So, all right, let's get to the really weird and fun stuff. Poststructuralism and deconstruction. Jacques Derrida, another Frenchman like Barthes, who builds upon Barthes, and creates what we call poststructuralism. And deconstruction is a method within poststructuralism of interpreting the text. It's a hermeneutic method, deconstruction is. Poststructuralism is a philosophy of language. What are we talking about here? There's probably almost as much misinformation about Derrida, poststructuralism, deconstruction, and postmodernism out there as there is for the Bible. Not nearly as much, but it's equally misunderstood in terms of the mistakes that are made, the depth of the mistakes. So Derrida begins in, I think it's about 1960, with an essay he gives at a conference on structuralism, right, on Saussure and Levi-Strauss, on structuralism, where it's titled Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. And his thesis is pretty simple but profound. And I won't torture you with the argument itself. But basically, he says, if the center is outside, it's no center. All right, what was he saying there? Think about it. Think about it in terms of the Bible. If the Bible is the inerrant word of God, where's God in it? Not there. The center is outside. Therefore, it's no center. And this, Derrida doesn't really talk much about the Bible, although he does have some interesting thoughts on the Hebrew Bible. He was Jewish. He was an Algerian Jew. So he, in fact, people have argued that he's basically doing rabbinical midrash, if you know what that is. Anyway, the center is outside, is no center. And this gets to Derrida's most important point in his philosophy that we find in Of Grammatology, his book Of Grammatology, but also everything else, is that language cannot hold metaphysical entities, a la God, but not just God, meaning, truth, the good, the beautiful. It cannot be found in language. And you can see now that this is an update of Saussure's notion that there's no referent in language, even though we've treated it that way for millennia. There's no referent in language. And the reason for that is this French phrase that I'm not going to try to pronounce because it's been too long, but it basically means there is no outside text. Okay, what does that mean? Well, this gets mistranslated often as there is no outside the text. Okay, and we get into this same problem, which is interesting, same problem that Fish had. Is there a reality outside of language? It's an interesting question, but it's not one that Fish or Derrida are really talking about. They're really talking about the nature of language, not what's outside language. So there is no outside text. There's only inside text, right? The text is self-contained. It's the version of his insight in Structure, Sign, and Play early on. If the center is outside, it's not a center. There's only the non-center. There's only the words, the signs. There is no outside text. So, put another way, every text is self-referential. Self-referential. Again, apply that to the Bible. And then Derrida's advancement of the argument is to take Saussure's notion that the sign is separate from the referent and to say the signifier is separate from the signified. Okay? So what does he mean by that? He means that not only is the referent unavailable, the annoying four-legged creature is not available to you in language, in the signification system. Neither is the mental image. There's only the signifier. And when I taught literary theory in Derrida in a classroom, here's what I would do. I would bring in a dictionary. And I had an actual print dictionary back then. I would bring it to class, and to illustrate Derrida's point that there is no outside text and that the signifier is separate from the signified, I would hand it to a student and I say, tell me what a text is. What's the definition of a text? And she would begin reading. A text is a collection of words. And I'm like, hold up. What are words? She'd flip to the W's and say, words are a linguistic unit of a sentence. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't know what a sentence is. And so this is what Derrida calls différence. It's not just difference between the signs. Remember that Saussure noted was how meaning is generated. But it's différence in French. It's deferral. You never get to the final meaning. All you get, he says, are traces. And the trace is actually an important philosophical concept for Derrida, the trace. So yes, people will misunderstand Derrida, who says there's no meaning in the world. There is meaning. It's just a trace. It's ephemeral. What does that sound like? That sounds like orality, right? Where when you speak a word, it's gone. Derrida actually kind of flips writing and what he calls the violence of the letter on its head and makes it more like orality. Now, that's a highly problematic statement I just gave you, so because he has a bone to pick with orality too. But this is essentially what he does with writing and signs. He says they're like spoken words. They're just traces. Fascinating, right? I think so, anyway. So, what does all this mean? So much. First of all, let's remember that the Bible is the ur-text, the megatext. It is the text that is the foundational text for Western culture. And we're going to see this in the lecture on the Bible and literature, how it has informed so much of the Western canon. The Bible is also the ur-text for hermeneutics, because we, as a culture and sometimes as individuals, have invested the Bible with the greatest meaning possible. So it should be interesting and it should be important just how we interpret the Bible. What are our hermeneutics of the Bible? Does the Bible have its own hermeneutics? Well, no, it doesn't. Although that's an interesting point we could debate. There's a connection here to Platonism, so that the Bible has been seen, its hermeneutics have been a hermeneutics of Plato, where we think that the words are connected to the things. And if you don't believe me, take a Bible out onto a sidewalk and spit on it. Well, what you're spitting on is paper. And okay, that's weird. Why are you doing that? But no, try spitting on a Bible in 17th century or the 16th century during the Inquisition. There's a connection there. We still have people place their hands on the Bible to swear in court, in secular court. there's still that lingering connection to Platonism. There's still this lingering connection to the mediums of writing and print. Even though the Bible was conceived in orality and contains many traces of orality, it is treated as an object, as a written and printed object. That's why you can use it as an object, such as swearing on it in court. Well, what does that mean? It means, remember what Ong said about the written word, and especially the printed word, is that it's frozen in time, right? So if you see the Bible as a written object, then you see that it is permanent, and you see its meaning as permanent, and you see the hermeneutics of determining its meaning as the highest stakes activity you can undertake, because you're talking about the meaning of everything. And its meaning is not, in this scenario, its meaning is fixed. It's just a step from that to the inerrant Word of God that I grew up with. But notice what you're doing with that hermeneutics. You're cutting off its oral genesis. You're cutting off its birth in orality and saying that didn't matter. And so all that matters is writing, which Ong says separates the knower from the known. It's a separation. And Derrida says even violence involved in writing. But biblical hermeneutics have been based in writing and print, not in orality. Despite that, and in some senses because of it, our biblical hermeneutics have been an attempt to control this text, to get it, to wrangle it into a single meaning. And in another lecture, we're going to talk about how that process worked, but the institutionalization of the Bible is, in a church, it is a process of biblical hermeneutics, of closing the door, of shutting down the interpretive process, or at least corralling it, and saying this is what this means. And the irony is that there are 40,000 interpretations of the Bible. That's why I say maybe it's because of that. One of the features of writing is an expanded notion of interpretation, because you're investing it with such high stakes that people come to it and want to see themselves in it. And if they don't see themselves in your hermeneutics, they'll insert their own. And they can do that because it's written and because it's not talking back. Can you imagine, right? If you were listening to Jesus preach there on the streets of Galilee and you said, yeah, no, that's not right, Jesus. I disagree with your interpretation. Can you imagine? Wouldn't that be awesome, right? Which probably happened, but that's the oral Jesus, right? That's the speaking Jesus. That's the Jesus of orality, which is the genesis of this written text. Oh my goodness. Thank you for hanging in here with me. It's been quite a ride. The final point is that meaning is in fact an expanding circle, and this is the lesson of deconstruction, of structuralism, of semiotics, of hermeneutics. And we're back to the God Hermes, who is not going to let you do that. He's not going to let you shut down interpretation. He likes crossroads. He likes trickery. And he likes to be involved in all of it. He also likes integration. Though he's not going to talk as much about that or do as much about that, because he knows that we have to do that ourselves. So meaning in any text becomes an expanding circle. Hermeneutics is the process. The Hermeneutic Circle is, in fact, an expanding circle, as you heard Gadamer talk about. And that's the Bible. So it's interesting that we see the multiplicity of biblical interpretations of biblical hermeneutics as a problem. It wouldn't be a problem for the Seneca, remember, when they got the message from the missionary about the story of the Bible, and they responded with the story about the origin of corn. More stories, the better. This happens regardless, and sometimes it is enhanced and exacerbated by your attempts to bring meaning to a closure. Bakhtin, the Russian philosopher and linguist, talks about the heteroglossia of the text, the other voices of the text, and there are always other voices. And despite millennia of biblical hermeneutics trying to shut down and shut out and exclude those voices, you can't, because there is no outside text. All right, thanks for listening. I'll see you in there.